we'll be covering how finance campaigning can help us win the fight against fossil fuels. Joining us for this is Heffa from Urgewald.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about the real potential of finance campaigning. The German playwright Bertolt Brecht once said, "Evil is not something abstract. It has a telephone number and an address." And we from Urgewald like to add, it also has a bank account. Our mission is to protect the environment by following the money. Because whatever the environmental problem is, clear-cutting forest, water pollution, climate change, someone is financing these activities. And challenging these financiers is a powerful avenue for change. Let's take the example of the coal industry. Everywhere it operates, the coal industry causes enormous damage to local communities and ecosystems. And it's the #1 source of CO2 emissions heating up our planet. Out of the 1 degree temperature rise that we're already experiencing, over 0.3 degrees are directly attributable to the combustion of coal. Fighting the coal industry is a question of survival. And one of the most effective means to fight the coal industry is to cut off its cash flows. Over the past 4 years, Urgewald and partner NGOs have moved European investors with over $10 trillion in assets to clean coal companies out of their portfolios. Just to give you a feel for what that number means, estimates are that global assets under management are around $100 trillion. So moving 10 trillion to divest coal companies, that's already a pretty big number. So how have we accomplished this? And what will it take to get the whole job done? And the whole job obviously also has to go beyond coal. It has to cover all fossil fuels. So in our experience, there are 3 crucial elements for successful finance campaigns. One is hard data. The second is a clear divestment ask. And the third is persistent public pressure. And now I'm going to walk you through each of those, and I'm going to use the example of the coal industry simply because that's where we have the most experience. So let's talk about hard data first. Now, people tend to assume that financial institutions know exactly who the coal industry is, but they don't. The reality is that most financial institutions have no idea which percentage of the utility's power production is coal-fired, and don't know which companies are planning new coal-fired power stations. And to be fair, it's often not that easy to figure this out. Let's look at 3 examples here. The company Limor Resources Limited is actually a company that's developing coal mines in Madagascar. Lucky Cement is building a coal-fired power station in Pakistan. You wouldn't guess that from its name. And Shine Energy is a company from Australia. If you visit their webpage, their motto is helping Australia transition to low-emission energy. But if you dig deeper, you'll see that Shine Energy is actually planning to build a new coal plant for over $2 billion in Queensland, Australia. So the first step towards stopping capital flows to the coal industry is to make companies' coal activities visible for financial institutions. And this is why Urgewald began compiling the Global Coal Exit List. Essentially, it's a database that provides statistics on all the different types of companies operating along the thermal coal value chain. Now, this is what the global coal exit list looks like. The availability of information has a huge impact on the finance industry's willingness to act. Let's say that the CEO of a financial institution is in principle willing to take action on coal. The first questions that come up are, how many companies in our portfolio would this affect? Which are those companies? And how large are the positions we hold in them? What would be the overall impact of this decision on our portfolio? Even progressive financial institutions are reluctant to adopt new policies if they don't know whether this means shedding 50 or 5,000 companies from a portfolio. The global coal exit list addresses that uncertainty. It lists 746 companies and provides detailed statistics on their coal activities. Now, for a typical large investor, the companies on the global coal exit list would account for maybe 1% of their portfolios. Divesting from these companies is not only necessary, it's doable. The second element I want to talk about is the divestment ask. We've all heard the slogan, keep coal in the ground. It's compelling, but it tends to narrow the divestment agenda to coal miners, and this is a problem. Large investors generally want to spread their risks by investing in all parts of the economy. So if money is withdrawn from coal mining, investors oftentimes reinvest it in coal-based utilities. So money is basically put from the left side of the slide to the right side of the slide. That's pretend divestment, and it's not what we want. To be effective, divestment has to cover all parts of the coal industry. And when I say all parts of the industry, I mean all parts. So not only coal mining and coal power companies, but also the coal traders, coal transport companies, the companies that convert coal to gas or coal to liquids, and also the companies that play a major role in enabling all of this, the exploration companies that go out there and identify the coal reserves in the first place, the companies that develop coal harbors and coal railways and enable the transport, the coal plant manufacturers that build the coal plants, that supply equipment for coal plants. And now, especially these enablers, they can often play a central role, actually. If you think about, let's say, coal reserves in central Borneo, they're never going to be developed unless there's coal transportation possibilities, which in that case means building a coal railway. Building the railway could be the key to whether those coal deposits are developed or not. The same is true for coal plant manufacturers. If you really look at the details of projects, you often discover that they're the real force behind the deals being made. They organize the financing. They go off and lobby governments to accept plans, to give them contracts to build a new coal plant. And corruption is a big problem here also, by the way. The divestment ask that's behind the global coal exit list, it's based on 3 criteria. And I also want to just run through these quickly. The first is a relative criteria, which addresses all companies for whom coal is a central part of their business model. So companies that have a coal share of revenue or a coal share of power generation of 30% or more. All of these companies should be divested immediately. The second criteria, which we call the absolute criteria, it's about the biggest coal plant operators and the biggest thermal coal producers. Even if their revenues are way below 30%, they're a central part of the coal industry, they also need to be divested. And the third criteria we use is all about coal expansion. So it covers companies that are planning new coal mines, new coal power plants, or new coal infrastructure, such as coal terminals or coal railways. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the expansion criteria, because I think it's really key here. If we look at what's happened since the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, we see that the global coal plant fleet has actually seen a net increase of 116 gigawatt. We're still heading in absolutely the wrong direction. 116 gigawatt, just to give you an idea of the dimension, that's Germany's, Russia's, and Australia's complete operating coal plant fleet. That much has been added. And what's worse, there's another 570 gigawatt in the pipeline. So coal plants that have been announced are already under development. And if these projects are not stopped, we have no chance of staying within the 1.5 degree Paris climate target. And this is one of the reasons why the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, spent most of 2019 traveling around, making public statements that we need to stop building new coal plants immediately. Now, if you look at where new coal plants are actually being built, it's in over 50 or planned, it's in over 50 countries worldwide. And in each and every of those countries, there's huge public opposition on the ground. In countries like Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, Russia, everywhere people are demonstrating against coal and the impacts that it brings for their lives, for their health, for their livelihoods, and for our climate. And this is one of the reasons also why it's so key to put pressure on financial institutions. Often the financial institutions that are building coal plants in these countries, they can be from somewhere else. If you take a look at the UK, for example, UK banks, they play a major role for many of the coal plants coming up in Asia. What the Global Coal Exit List enables is for financial institutions to see exactly who are the 258 companies that are responsible for that huge pipeline of new coal power stations and to take action on it. That these 258 coal plant developers, some of these would also be addressed by the other two criteria we're using for the Global Coal Exit List, but around half of them wouldn't be. And that's an important point. The reason why these companies are not covered by the other criteria is that many of them are new to the coal industry, don't have existing coal operations, or are very diverse companies. And just to pick the example of one country, Vietnam is a hotspot of global coal plant development. It actually has the 4th largest coal plant pipeline in the world. And if you look at some of these company names here on the left, Petro Vietnam, it's not a coal company, it's an oil company. It nonetheless wants to begin building coal plants in Vietnam. Marubeni, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, those are huge Japanese trading houses. Very diverse business. They do everything from selling cookies to building cruise ships. And a tiny part of their business is in coal. But that business is very, very harmful. Texong Textile Group, it's a textiles company from Hong Kong. They nonetheless want to build a big textiles industrial park in Vietnam and build a 2,100 megawatt coal plant to power it. Toyo Inc., it's a Malaysian packaging ink company. For reasons unknown to me, they seem to think it's a good idea to build a coal plant in Vietnam. Aqua Power is at least a power company, but up to now, Aqua Power, all they've done is mainly build dams and done some gas power development, but no coal. They're just beginning to be a player in the coal industry. Without the global coal exit list, these companies would not be visible as players in the global coal plant pipeline problem. And it's not only companies building new coal plants that we need to be concerned about, it's also companies developing new coal mines. Sumitomo, the Japanese trading house, is a typical case. This is a picture showing basically what it says today on Sumitomo's webpage, which is that the company wants to develop coal mines, coal railways, and coal ports as a package, and sees this as a growth area in its business. And it's doing this in countries like Russia, Indonesia, Mongolia, plenty of places outside the world. The other thing about the global coal exit list is that when financial institutions do begin adopting policies, it allows us to measure how big or small those coal divestment steps actually are. And just to give you a current example, BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager and recently announced a new policy on thermal coal. Now, we took a close look at that policy and quickly discovered that actually BlackRock's new coal policy, it only applies to thermal coal mining companies that are above a certain, have above a certain coal share of revenue. And if we run that policy through the global coal exit list, we see that in actuality, it only excludes 20% of the companies on the global coal exit list. So basically, what we can say is 80% of the problem is still in BlackRock's portfolio. That policy is not, it doesn't do what it should. Now I want to move on to the last point, the last element that is crucial for successful finance campaigning. And it's perhaps also the most important element. It's persistent public pressure. Financial institutions that are bankrolling coal operations need to be held to account. This is a report that Urgewald, together with an NGO called Banktrack, brought out last December and shows that the big UK banks have, over the last 3 years, spent billions on financing coal plants all over the world. And that information, it needs to go everywhere. This is an example of one of the newspaper articles, Reuters, that appeared on this report. The institutions that are responsible for bankrolling the coal industry, they need to be held to account. The topic needs to be brought to the shareholder meetings of financial institutions, and it needs to be brought to their attention by public protest in front of banks, in front of insurance companies, and again and again and again. Reputational risk is our strongest weapon. I want to talk a little bit about the persistence. What we often see is when an institution first adopts a coal policy, the step isn't that big, and it takes persistent pressure to make them end up where they need to end up. AXA is the world's third largest insurance company. It's a French insurer. AXA began taking action on coal in 2015. They excluded 50 coal companies from their portfolio. In 2017, they took on some of the global coal exit list criteria, and they excluded another 200 coal companies from their portfolio. They also stopped providing direct insurance for coal plants and coal mines. NGOs at the time congratulated them on this step, but after about 2 weeks, they said, look, this still isn't enough, and began carrying on the next campaign. In 2019, November, AXA came out and excluded another 500 companies from its investment portfolio. Now, if you add those up, it's about 750 companies in total, which is basically the entire global coal exit list. And what AXA also did is that they came out and said, companies that are still planning new coal mines or new coal power plants, we are not going to provide corporate insurance for them anymore. That goes further than what they did in 2017 when they said, okay, no direct insurance anymore for coal plants or coal mines. Corporate insurance means if those companies, if they want any kind of insurance, liability insurance for their CEOs or accident insurance, or if they want insurance for their buildings or their vehicles, AXA is not going to provide it. That's a really key step and a sign of a big investor stepping up to do what's right when it comes to coal. Remember, I talked about the 10 trillion. Another that have, in terms of global assets under management, that have waved goodbye to the coal industry. Another one of those actors is Crédit Agricole. It's the 8th largest bank in the world. And it's institutions like this that actually show what we're asking for, divesting all those companies on the global coal exit list. It can be done, and it needs to be done. And even big financial institutions are doing it. What do those 10 trillion that I talked about, what kind of impact are they having? Are they actually achieving what we need to achieve? Let's ask the coal industry itself. This is a quote from the deputy CEO of Indonesia's 2nd largest coal company. And at a coal conference, he's talking about how difficult it has become to find financing for coal power plants, because many European banks and export credit agencies are ruling out coal financing, and even Japanese banks are starting to say no. Here's another example. Eskom is South Africa's largest coal plant operator. And here's the CEO of Eskom talking about how hard it is to find investment in fossil fuel projects. If you were to listen in to a coal industry conference, I could tell you from my own experience, they're beginning to sound sort of like sad therapy groups where everybody is complaining to each other about how bad things have become. What's even more important, I believe, is that not only is it becoming more difficult and more costly, therefore, for companies to try and go on with coal-based expansion, but you have first companies that are actually changing their plans and dropping them. Here's an example from a very large coal plant operator from Hong Kong, China Light and Power, which came out last December and said, we're dropping all those plans for new coal plants, even the projects that we've already begun. So this is what 10 trillion is already doing. Let's just imagine what things would look like if we managed to move more of those trillions. So all I think we really need to do is speed things up a lot. Finance campaigning is an extremely powerful tool, but it's still very much underutilized. If we truly want to win the battle for our climate, we will need to change financial institutions. Help us make it happen. Thank you.
The very first question that I got now is, who is collecting this data for the global coal exit list?
Our research team. For us, it was a big step to become a research organization as well as a campaigning organization. And initially, we thought, this is crazy. There's got to be a database someplace where you can look all this up. And we began looking at different databases, but we found that they were all missing a lot of coal companies that we knew from our campaigning work really needed to be on that list. And that's why we decided to do our own database and to make it public. And the good thing is it's being used by a lot of financial institutions. It's having a lot of influence. We were initially kind of worried because we thought, oh God, if a campaigning NGO does a database, will that be accepted? But it seems that, the quality of that information, it's very attractive to many financial institutions. Doesn't always mean that if they're using it, that they're using it in the way we would like them to use it, which means divesting. Sometimes they're using it in other ways and beginning to engage with companies, but it, in any case, is having a big, big impact.
And a different question was from Joe. What of the UK banks and financial institutes would you ask people to target to get them to quit coal?
The big three: Barclays, Standard Chartered, and HSBC. Those should be the major targets.
And then there's, how can you know that access decisions have anything to do with protests? Perhaps it's due to gas and wood being cheaper now. It seems like it could just be business dressed up as environmentalism.
The thing is that even, of course, there are people also inside financial institutions who are concerned about climate or who simply think, oh, well, some of those coal projects, they haven't done real well economically. But the reality is that we see that financial institutions, they don't do strong policies on their own. It takes pressure from outside. And even when they're advocates inside the institutions, there has to be pressure from outside as well. And we can see it with the timing of when those decisions happen. And we can also see it from our own conversations with people within financial institutions. I mean, sometimes we even have bankers call us up and say, can you please put pressure on my bank because of such and such deal coming up, or I'm making no headway. I mean, that kind of thing also happens. So I think I can very confidently say that without pressure by the climate movement, without pressure by NGOs, policies would not be where they are. But I also think, if financial campaigning, if it's taken up in a bigger way, if more of attention from the climate movement is put on financial institutions, we could really, really speed things up. Because the thing is, they're much more sensitive to what we call reputational risk. As a financial institution, they have to care more about what their customers think. And it's very different from if you're campaigning and protesting in front of a fossil fuel company. They don't have reputational risk.
And then there's another question from Roxana. She asked on Twitter, how can big countries like Mexico, the US, or Brazil be free from coal if they have such a big need of energy and if they have such a large territory that they need to supply with energy?
Well, this is the thing. Coal is 100% replaceable. There is no need for coal plants anywhere. There's cheaper and environmentally sounder opportunities. I mean, if a country like Germany, which doesn't have that much sunshine, can basically have almost 40% renewables in its energy mix, this is really not a problem for Mexico, say, or Brazil.
And I'm just going through the questions. Please keep sending questions if you've got any. We've got a few asking if we've got a list or something similar that we send to financial advisors or pension funds, asking them to not invest in pension funds. I think you might be able to explain a bit more about how you interact with those financial institutions.
So we also do a lot of engagement with financial institutions. Like, our approach as an organization is that we first actually try and talk to them and explain what we want them to do. And give them examples of, investors or banks who have already moved into and in some cases that can already lead to some changes, but generally our experience is that the most happens where there's actual public pressure also on those institutions. And what's great about the Global Coal Exit List is that it makes it easy to do what we're asking for. It's a precise list of companies. It's like a big divestment to-do list, basically.
Then I've got a bit more of a general question, which is kind of a very different topic, but I think that could be interesting. How do we explain to the world of finance that increasing the world GDP is not sustainable, since we don't know how to create economic growth without consuming fossil fuels? That's a big question.
That's a very big question, and I'm really not sure how to answer that. I mean, right now it's about changing the culture of these institutions in a way, It's not as if banks are not financing renewables. They're doing that as well, but they also like continuing to finance coal or other fossil fuels. And it's because in the banking culture, you're trying to do as many deals as possible. And not doing those deals means, at least initially, you're sacrificing business. And it takes a real cultural change for those institutions to say, okay, we're going to sacrifice business for the greater good. And it takes everyone basically all of us have bank accounts, right? And it takes us telling those institutions, you need to change.
Now, I'm very sorry that we're jumping around between topics, but since questions are just coming in now, I'm just kind of trying to filter out the questions that could be really interesting to most people. So now let's jump back to the Global Coal Exit List. Todd is asking on Zoom whether the same list can be produced for oil divestment and gas divestment.
I just want to add something to the earlier question before. I had a really interesting conversation with actually the CEO of a big insurance company. And in that conversation, we were talking about some of their investments, which are still in coal, and the need to clean that out more quickly. And for me, it was an unusual experience because I criticized this company, and the CEO said, okay, we'll change that. And I thought, oh, wow, that was easy. And but then being an NGO, I got suspicious, and I thought, but when will they change that? How long will it take? So in the break, I went to him and I said, well, what kind of time frame are we looking at here? And he basically said, we got to move really fast. All those kids protesting on the street, we want those to be our future customers. We need to clean up our act. So I think that sort of public opinion in general, public protest, but especially when it's directed towards financial institutions, that's an important part of changing the culture and changing the business at any cost, even if it ruins the planet. But back to the other question. After having seen how the Global Coal Exit List has really helped speed up action by the finance industry, we're highly motivated to begin also doing an oil and gas exit list. It's actually much harder to do that than on coal because the oil and gas industry is so much bigger. but we're currently doing a kind of scoping exercise to also figure out what the right criteria are and what kind of metrics need to be in that list to make it as useful as possible, not only for financial institutions, but also for NGOs, and also to be able to measure what new fossil fuel policies by financial institutions do or don't do. And we hope to have at least a first version of such a list next year. But it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of research work, looking through one company annual report after the other. I'm glad I'm not in our research team.
All right, and then there's another question. I think we've already touched on that, but maybe we could elaborate a bit. Why are financial institutions still even funding coal? Why are they not just funding renewables?
I think in a way I've already answered that, because they're playing on both teams. They want to make as many deals as possible. Generally, banks, what they care about is earning money, and they don't care so much about what that money is actually used for. That's the traditional way a banker looks at the world. And it's part of the reason why we have all the problems that we do have. Because lots of stuff is getting financed. I mean, not only, I showed you a few slides at the beginning, it's not only all about climate, it's about biodiversity crisis, it's about human rights crisis, it's on all levels.
Then I'm just going through the questions once again. There's a question asking, obviously we all have bank accounts, and obviously we all have our money somewhere, but not all of us interact with, let's say, asset managers. And are there different types of pressure for different people we can make use of? And are there also different ways you interact with different financial institutions? So would you apply a different kind of pressure to asset managers as you would do to banks, for example?
It's actually much, much easier for asset managers or investors to move than for banks to move. Because the thing is, if let's take a big insurance company, or let's just take any kind of investor. If I exclude coal companies or other fossil fuel companies from my portfolio, I'm not making a business sacrifice. I'm just investing differently. Actually, my portfolio could benefit from it. And especially looking now at how oil and gas prices are just going to the basement, it can even be financially beneficial to divest. For banks, that's different, because if they're saying we want to do business with companies that are planning new coal plants or have over 30% coal share of power generation, yeah, they're losing business. So it's a different kind of sacrifice. It's the same for insurers when they're saying we will not insure certain companies anymore. They're also taking a business sacrifice. So in general, actually for investors, it should be much easier. So generally, my observation is that it takes less pressure to make investors change than to make banks change. Banks are the part that's hardest.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Heffa, for taking your time and doing that great presentation. We'll hopefully see you in a different webinar again.